Hello, guys. We're back. We're back on air. I'm. Okay, that was a fiery uh, first
You
hour.
see,
There was there was so much tea being spilled that we didn't know where to start or where to end.
I know it was all happening.
It was all happening. But let's go into the question again.
Mm,
And if I just refocus minds on why we're here, the
mm.
power imbalance, decentering the narrative of white.
Oh, you're gonna say the S word, aren't you?
Supremacy.
Do you want me to speak into that one?
Yeah, we can just dip into that one.
Yeah, I feel like it's important to break some stuff down because I think when people hear the word white supremacy, it can feel quite a very hard word, a very disruptive word because we are told that white supremacy is like the KKK or
Mm.
extremist groups. So I want to make it really clear. These are perhaps manifestations or what we see as white supremacy. But I come from a particular school of thought called critical race theory that says that white supremacy is something that is systemic and it's structural, it's institutional. And that means it exists in laws, in policies, in unequal distribution of resources and materials, and that people of color are on the kind of negative end. They will not get it or will be punished, and people who are racialized as white will have more access to it, will have privileges and entitlement. So race is an outcome of white supremacy, but white supremacy is this kind of a system of design to keep racial inequalities and inequities in place between white people and people of color. So I just want to make that point really clear. And then how that plays out in the academy is kind of just wanting to throw back to the how we started off. Is the ways in which I always, there's a classic tweet of like racism is my class being an elective and white culture being the curriculum. That is like, and that's true. And I say this as someone who's like teaching an elective on hip hop cultures,
Yeah,
whereas these students are their main curriculum, their main design course is going to be modernism.
so important.
So yeah, just wanted to make that really clear so people are like, what?
Oh, we have to dip into the whole modernism feudal.
Not to bring that back in, but
It,
you
but it,
probably,
like
yeah.
I bring it always in because modernism was my main course and colonialism was an elective in the second class.
Mm. And
As
I don't know what you studied as your BA, but I'd be intrigued to know whether there was a connection ever made between these two things.
yes,
Okay.
because I had Shahida Bari as
Okay.
I had her as my modernism, and it's there's a course that is the flagship course at Queen Mary for the undergrad because it's called English and post-colonial English and what was it? English and Commonwealth.
Hmm.
I think
That's interesting.
it's English literature and of the Commonwealth.
Oh wow.
So that's how it was packaged. That's how it was
Hmm.
done. And the course
Does that
itself,
course still exist?
yes, that's my English. It's the
I mean,
English.
does it still exist now? Is it still a BA now?
It is.
Oh wow, that's amazing. I've never
It's an, ama-
look.
it's an amazing BA, and it left me choked to go back in. There's also
Mm,
a colonial pathway for MA that I was looking
mm,
at, which would have been amazing. Bill Schwartz is on it, Rachel Gilmore, and a few other academics that
mm,
I respected. So that's my background. Uh, but the course that I'm talking about is architects. So
mm.
they went from I forget the name of the original quotation. There's a quotation that came from somewhere basically that talks about the four what does it call them? The four fathers of modernism, practically. Hegel, Marx, Freud, and
The can't. Sorry, but he is.
beforehand, but
Okay.
it doesn't feature Hegel, Marx, Freud. There's another
Yeah.
one, Nietzsche.
Oh, I know Nietzsche talks about dancing being radical, so sometimes I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
He was big on dancing.
that was the course, and there's four of them, and then
Mm.
we read all of the kind of big people that followed them, all the way down to Slavoj Žižek, who's the last
Mm.
course. So it was quite extensive, and the point at which I felt most comfortable was reading Spivak and Fanon
Mm.
in relation to all of these other thinkers, and it really gave you the architecture of how white
Mm.
supremacy looks like, and the modernist tradition
Mm.
and its underpinnings.
That's interesting. I mean, I come from a very different background. So my first degree, I went to design school, so I studied fashion journalism. So I was heavily, one would argue, inducted into modernism as a design discourse, and it being a very white thing. Um, and then I did my MA in cultural studies at Goldsmith, and actually, surprisingly, it was a very white course. I had an opportunity to do electives,
Mm.
which where I could branch out, but my main curriculum of my MA was Walter Benjamin. It was basically the Frankfurt School,
Yeah,
and then we had the post-structuralists like Barthes and stuff like that. That's what I was taught.
lazy laziness.
Yes. um, so yeah, complete. No, but it was. It really was because the cultural theory. I mean, Stuart Hall wasn't even taught.
How
And
could
Stuart Hall's
you
really integral
start?
to the space of Goldsmiths.
He's the one that started.
Exactly. That has started the
Yeah,
whole concept of
this
cultural
respect,
studies.
putting
We
this
didn't even
respect.
teach Angela McRobbie, and she teaches at Goldsmiths. She wasn't even on the curriculum, and she's really important
Or a
to
little more.
cultural studies. Yeah, the course was really. Hopefully, it's different now. This is 10 years ago, also. So I'm going to presume that the faculty is different, but it was a very white course. Where am I going with this? Sorry.
This is going. This is going on. We're doing a genealogical study and how
um,
we came to be where we are.
yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe this is how did we become who we are. So yeah, so my first degree is design. It's based in design experience, and then I wanted to do a more academic degree, so I did this MA, and then I was very disheartened by it because I thought Goldsmiths was going to be a very radical experience. I thought I was going to,
They
you
call it,
know,
but they usually cage you in your radicalism.
yeah. I just remember feeling very dismayed and really upset about my experience at Goldsmiths, and remember just thinking that I need to just get through this. I was really unhappy with what I was being taught. I couldn't get my head round as to why the curriculum was so white. I was also the only person of colour on my MA, and that came with particular tensions that when I would speak, people just look at me really weird, like I was speaking
Another language.
another language. I remember feeling very othered and just not made to feel welcome in a course that I was paying for with my hard-earned money.
Mm.
Yeah, so I had a tutor, but it turns out he was really dodgy, but he wasn't dodgy towards me, who was more or less cool with, and I would, talk to him and stuff, and he sympathized a lot with my position. He was a white straight man. It turns out I won't name his name, but it turns out there were issues around sexual misconduct with other students. Just gonna leave that there.
That's
But I want to make that clear that wasn't a situation with me.
mm-hmm.
But it turns out when I left, a couple of years later, it's one of the reasons why Sarah Ahmed left, due to the big situation of sexual misconduct amongst female staff and female students in Goldsmith, and the kind of power structure not doing anything about it. And this particular person was implicated in that. as a bit of tea on a Sunday
Yeah.
afternoon, a bit of gossip.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it just made me feeling really just disheartened and just really like, what is academia? And so I did not work in academia for a very long time. In fact, I was running a community group for young women in Hackney for about 5 years. And then the opportunity to come out to do my PhD came, and it was a very flippant thing. I was just like, let me see how this goes. Um, so I pull it in. I mean, that story is crazy. I applied for my PhD when I was with my ex-partner and was living in Beirut, in Lebanon, and we didn't have any internet. And then my partner got deported. It was a crazy. He got deported back to England. So I was like in Beirut on my own. It's actually really nuts when I think about this situation. So he got deported. He is white. He's still alive.
Okay.
And I remember he was like really upset about being deported. And I was just like, fuck off. Like, black and brown people get deported all the time in the UK. You just finally experience that your white male privilege could do nothing to protect you, yeah. And you got treated, they didn't give a shit that you were British, and they didn't give a shit that you were white. They said, get out of our fucking country, you know? So he got deported, and so it was this really chaotic situation about the housing, and it was in his name, and Lebanese people quite racist. So when the landlord came, she saw me. Yeah, it was just a mess. Anyway, I'm applying to do this PhD. I missed the deadline. I'm like, oh no. Anyway, I get it in through hook or crook, and then I got an interview. I was genuinely surprised. I missed it by about 2 days, and I got an interview to do this. So I had to come back to the UK much earlier than planned. Again, that was a scramble because, you know, all of our stuff was in this property, and we didn't have time to properly ship it back over. And I had to come back really quickly to do the interview because it would have been more efficient for me to physically come back to the UK than to rely on Lebanese electricity. Let's put it that way.
For the internet.
For the internet, because it cuts off. It can cut off at any point, you know? Even if you have a generator. And people steal your stuff as well. Like, people will steal your water tank. It's crazy. It's really crazy sometimes when things get really tough. I understand why people do it, but...
It sounds like Angola. So I have a little bit of, how can I put it? I know I should be used. If someone's gonna pick me up on the language that I use, it's the global south.
Yeah, it is. It's how, you know, yeah, it's how things operate. So it was like, I might as well come back to the UK and take what I could take with like me in terms of like our belongings. Half our shit is still probably scrapped now, or someone's taking it, like whatever. Because we couldn't get back to Beirut to get... He's not allowed. If he goes back into Lebanon to this day, he will go to prison because the Lebanese authorities were convinced he's an Israeli spy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but also they had good reason because of the kind of work that he did. So he did a lot of work. He did a lot of like white do-gooding, like white saviorism work of like going to like hot conflicts and like do mediation and working with activists and all this kind of stuff. So, and then you're going to Sudan, you're going to Iraq. Where has he been to? Where else has he been to? South Sudan. He was working in. He did a bit of work in Iraq. He did. He was in Jordan. He was in Egypt. It looks dodge. Why is this white guy traveling around the Middle East? You know, like, what are you doing?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. So they were like, Lebanese authorities were convinced he was up to no good. And we got followed. I mean, my mum doesn't even know this, so I shouldn't even speak too loudly, but we were followed. Yeah, it was like, again, nuts. His passport was confiscated several times. He's making like twice a month. You have to go to like British embassy to like sign in. It was just, yeah, it was a lot. I don't know why I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous. It's like, it's not even actually funny, but it's funny of like I didn't even know. I want to highlight this as a preface, right? Yeah. I didn't know this was a situation until I got there. He did not tell me this is what he had to do twice a month. I didn't know that he had to go to British embassy in Lebanon to sign in twice a month to show his passport. Yeah.
He missed one of his sign-in dates, so they went after him.
Yeah, very much. We went to Egypt. Basically, we went to... It was poorly timed. So we went to Egypt and Jordan for like about 2 weeks. And he didn't. So he missed in his sign-in date. So when we was coming back through to the Lebanese border from Egypt, so basically we planned the trip because Egypt to Beirut is like an hour, and then Beirut to Lebanon to Jordan is an hour. So we plan to do 2 trips in one day. So we plan when we come back to Beirut from Egypt, we'll literally go back, drop our stuff to our apartment because we live very close to the airport, like a 15 minutes drive, and then change our clothes and then go to our next holiday to Jordan. So when we're coming through the border, I get through okay, and he stopped, and it's like about 3:00 in the morning. And I'm like, why? Like, what's going on? So I go back and I'm like, what's going on? And the guy's like, we can't let him in because we let him in. It says on the system, I have to arrest him. And we're like, why? It's like, it's because he's missed his registration. So as far as we're concerned, he's got an AWOL, right? And I'm like, no, we was like in holiday, like, it was like we were in holiday in Egypt. Our time, everything, our flights was delayed. So this is what happened. And he's like, look, I don't care what the situation is. This is what it says. My monitor says this is what I have to do.
Yeah.
And so we're like, what can we do? And he's like, what's happening next? So I was like, well, we're meant to be going to Jordan in like 4 hours time. We need to go and check in and stuff. And so the guy was just like, I think it was like 3:00 in the morning. I think he just couldn't be bothered. He was like, look, he needs to stay in transit. I need to take the paperwork and then go and register us for Royal Air Jordan Airline. So I was like, okay, cool. So I take Derek's passport, I take our plane tickets, but Derek has our visas for Jordan, right? And so in order for you to get on a plane to Jordan, you have to prove beforehand that you have these visas. So I go to do the diligent thing of like, hey, let me go. Here's my passport. Here's, Derek's passport. Here's our ticket. And so the lady doing her job, she's like, so your visas, madam? And I'm like, visas? She's like, I was like, is he not there? She's like, no. I was like, Derek's got the visas. So I'm like, I don't even know where he is. I'm calling, his phone is not picking up. I'm trying to find, and in Beirut, the army is in the airport and they hold their borders. So you're seeing guys with like AK-47s, right, walking up and down. So I ran up to this guy, to this to the Lebanese soldier, and I'm like, look, this is the situation. And he's like, what's your name? So the guy takes his name down. Now, because France colonized Lebanon, they have the same laissez-faire attitude to public service, which is it might get done, it might not get done. You just have to hope for the best. And if anyone who's been to Paris, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you may get it, you may not get it. You just hope for the best, right? Same attitude in Lebanon. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, like of all the countries to be in, at least in Britain, shit would get done. So I'm like an hour before we're about to board a plane, which means I'm not going to get on this plane. The man eventually comes back to me and says, I was able to locate your partner. Here are the visas for you to sign in. And I was just like, like panic. And then, so we go to Jordan, we have a great time, and then he has to come back. He can't go. If he physically came back into Beirut, he will probably still be in prison to this day. So he then gets another flight to the UK, hence why he got more or less deported. He couldn't come back in. Then I had to come back to Beirut on my own. I mean, yeah, think about that story. And then in that process, we don't have a proper generator. We don't have proper water. Relying on the state water, which sometimes happens.
Sometimes
doesn't happen. Relying on state electricity, which sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't happen. So you have to conserve water in water bottles and buckets because when you get water, right? And you just have to try and conserve as much as you can because you don't know when you're going to get water again. Unfortunately, you can't do the same with electricity. And so, so I applied for this PhD in these conditions. I call up one of my close friends. I'm having to verbatim tell her my application. So she's doing this on the phone on her, in the UK, And I'm like, can you write this? And she signs into my Gmail and she sends it on my behalf. And it's 2 days late. Anyway, 4 years later, I'm doing this PhD. I'm still here on it. So I always believe, like this PhD was made for me. Like I was meant to have that opportunity.
Yeah.
Because the conditions in which I had to go through
it sounds like
to get
a
it
fire.
was near impossible,
It was a trial by fire, and
Yeah.
no one's gonna take that away from you.
No,
Uh,
I mean, can't talk about certain things, but yeah. I mean, there's situations where I technically should have been kicked off my program for things, and I haven't. That's all I'm gonna say.
yeah.
If you Google me and you'll see who I'm doing my PhD with, you probably might be able to add things up together. But I'm still here. So I just always feel like this PhD, I'm meant to do this PhD for whatever reason why. I'm meant to produce something to contribute to the world. And so a lot of my PhD is kind of, the conversations that we had about modernism and the way and the erasure of people of colour in modern art and how that,
Also transfers in academia.
you just took the words right out of my mouth, and how that forms a particular kind of knowledge production where there is an epistemic violence of black and brown people's exclusion.
It's funny because I was speaking to Georgian diaspora, so Serena of Georgian diaspora,
Yeah.
and she mentioned that she wants to go into academia, but she's ambivalent about going, and we want to actually start up a support group for us.
Yeah.
We want to eventually go into academia or do something similar and fill up the positions that there are so many curators of African literature or African culture that have no connection to the continent apart from an accident of birth sometimes or an accident of study, that it in itself means that we end up othering ourselves and going for things that might be beneficial to have a person of that category in that, holding up and studying and looking up at their own sort of.
It's really important, and I say this as someone who's teaching, who has been, I've been working as like a fractional staff for like about 4 years, but now I'm in a permanent post and just coming to a full academic year in that post. And I think for students, and I wouldn't even just say for students of colour, but also for white students, seeing someone who inhibits our kind of bodies, teaching and being in a position of knowledge production and knowledge holding is a radical thing, because I think it really disrupts that paradigm of power imbalance of whose knowledge, what gets taught, the erasure. And the bodies, how those bodies, those physical, material, bodies are also erased. And so maybe it's very an ego thing. It is an ego thing. I'll be honest about that. But I have been posting on my Instagram, and like students send me really cute emails about, thank you for teaching me this today, or I really enjoyed that lecture. And I'm like, that's really great to have that feedback. But I also think there's something deeper about students, especially students of colour, reaching out to give me that feedback, and that, to say like, because really it's about, I see you, and you see me. And it's about the raising of visibility and affirming them in that space that it's possible to teach certain topics because they have credibility. They are, intellectually heavy. There is a rigorousness behind it. We're going to use all of that kind of language of academia, and therefore it means that their lives and their culture has value. Yeah.
They can do it. I think that's where our conversation really goes into it now, because a lot of the time we pathologize, falsely pathologize our misplacement in this universe of things. And as an atom within this kind of spinning ball system, we need to sometimes just take our own personal misgivings and put them to aside. For example, I would never have got the advice that even if you miss the PhD deadline by 4 days or like a 2-day spurt, to actually just still submit it.
Yeah.
So just in the same way as people don't check their emails for however many days.
Yeah.
Like, that sort of conversation doesn't usually happen.
Mm,
People don't want to have those conversations.
mm,
It makes a mockery of timing because
mm.
at the end of the day, it still goes back to an imperialist idea of you know, of a person's whereabouts, because time is in essence it's another force like coronavirus.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
exists, but it also doesn't exist because we can't see it.
Mm, totally. I feel like um, with the submitting the application late, I remember just thinking, what have I got to lose? It's already late, right? It just means they probably would dismiss it because it's late. Um, Again, it didn't happen. And like, I have been in situations more like formal spaces with potential PhD students of color, specifically Black students, around the process of applying for PhDs and sharing experiences and stuff. So I'm always mindful to caveat that my situation is so bizarre, like so
Yeah,
random.
yeah.
Um, but things can be extracted that can be, generic. And I think the biggest thing is that just apply for it anyway, because you never know what might happen. And I feel like that's the messaging that I always like to give from my stories, that I was in the most harshest of conditions and random of situations, but
Mm.
I still did it anyway. And I would always do believe if something is for you, it's for you, and
And
nothing
it's
and no
not
one can
you,
stop
it's
that.
not for you.
Exactly, and that's the other thing. Like, if you get rejected from that program, maybe because that department wasn't the department for you, or that supervisor wasn't going to be the person who's going to give you the support that you really need. Because when
You
I'm
need
very lucky, so
to, you need to find the right department.
yeah, it's very true. You need to find the right department and the right supervisor. I would actually even say it's about the supervisor more than the department, because you're going to be in a
Mm.
very close proximity intellectually,
With
emotionally,
the
with
person.
this person for about 3 to 4 years. Um, and you're going to be in a very vulnerable state of showing them your writing, and they're going to give you feedback, and
You're gonna have to
you're going to
change it.
have, yeah, you're going to have to change it if you accept it. And so you're going to be in this very kind of intimate dance between another human being who's going to be so integral to your project, to your PhD project, and that it's
Yeah.
about finding that person who can give you the space and time, and also the care, because this is a very fragile point in your life.
Mm. No one talks about the mental labor that a PhD
Mm,
takes and the toll that a PhD
mm,
would take in that in that sense. You always
mm.
see the end result, you know,
Yeah,
doctor,
perhaps, yeah.
philosophy, and you see the hat coming on.
Mm,
Then you realize it's only the beginning, because you know you've just been qualified again. You like with most systems, you've just gone through the mill and
yeah.
you've done that thing, and then you're on top of the circle, and you're all the way back to the bottom because
Yeah, until you go.
you have to get the tenure now, and then you have to
Yeah.
do that, and then you have to write more, and then you have to do the circuits, and then you have to
Mm,
teach, and you know, like, wow, there's
yeah.
a lot.
Again, this is what I mean. Like, my situation is very different because I actually got a job before I finished my doctorate, which is actually quite unusual for the kind of
Super unusual.
in cultural
Yeah,
studies. Like, because it's a more theoretical space. So my story, when I reflect on it in terms of both the PhD story but also having an academic appointment, is again quite unusual, because it's normally you have to have your you need to be qualified with your PhD beforehand. um I mean, there's other factors. I mean, I'm very transparent about how I got my job. I got my job on positive discrimination, because at UAL, there's no point in hiding stuff. Like, you know me for a very long time, Eduardo, so I'm quite
yeah.
upfront
No,
about
and I don't mind.
things.
This is why
And
I love the fact that we're having this discussion and we're shooting people in the barrel.
yeah, and I think it's for lots of reasons. The reason why I choose to have it's a very radical positionality to have, because it enables other people to support them to carve out their own journey and their own
Yeah.
route, whether it is in academia or teaching or whatever pathway they want to take for themselves. And I didn't have that. Like, I am transparent that I do come from a middle class background. My mum has a professionality in law, but she's not an academic, and I don't have any academics in my family who's done PhD. So in terms of like my family circle, I'm the first person to do this. So if people are thinking or wondering, I'm always open to having conversations. So yeah, basically I got my job through protest discrimination because UAL was diversified in the workforce to acknowledge how white it is. And I want to be transparent that most white academics get their jobs on protest discrimination too. So the difference is mine was just very clear that that's what the process was. We call it implicit bias,
Yeah.
So that's how I got my job. And for the most part, I enjoy. I'm teaching things that I like reading and knowing about, which is cultural theory in its expansive, from Marxist thought to feminist thought to art history, media theories, design practices. So I get to teach across a whole, theoretically and critically, a whole area of discourses that I love learning about and knowing. And I have chosen to bring in the practices and ideas of Black and brown people's practices because that is wholly absent. Sometimes I get a bit frustrated because I feel like I'm in response, because there's white artists that I do actually want to talk about who I think have great work, and there's white theorists.
Let someone else do that.
Exactly, precisely. And I feel like, well, I'm going to let someone else do that labour, because no one else is going to write about the POCs that I'm really interested in or both historically and contemporary. So I've actively chosen to talk about people of colour's contribution conceptually, practically, creatively on my course.
I always find that this discussion becomes more interesting on the 30th minute.
Are we in the 30th minute already?
Yeah, like this discussion always becomes more active in the 30th.
It's going the arc.
The arc of understanding is like that. It's like that, and then you reach the 30th minute, and then you actually just crystallize what we want to say. The whole idea behind in conversations for me is, I think it's because I miss the academic environment. Let's get it clear. I think it's because I miss the academic environment. I miss having someone that I can learn from, have others who can also learn from me. That kind of each one teaching one pedagogical field is what I'm actually crying out for continuously. So this is also fulfilling something very selfish within me, but it's also a part of me understanding other, on a curatorial basis, understanding other practices and understanding where I want to position myself and also position others. Because if I don't have these conversations, I'm not going to know what the work that so-and-so is doing, or what like what are the journeys that people take. That's part of my practice. I like to understand journeys. I like to understand the story. I like to get that part out of it. Let's talk about fiction now.
Okay.
How do you feel like the representation of Blackness in fiction in the UK context?
I knew.
Not American context.
I have to be so transparent. I'm just purchased Queenie because I really want to read that book. And I've just purchased Girl, Woman, Other
by Bernardino Verisco.
Yeah, those are the two books that are on its way to me, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Because actually I realised, and I'm going to be so hands up transparent, I'm more likely to read North American literature on Blackness than I am to read British stuff. I want to be.
This is the problem.
I want to be like.
This is the actual problem, because we spend so much time. Why do we always seek American examples in order to our positioning? I understand. We covered this in the first live, and it got destroyed by Instagram's then problems with the
algorithm
that have now been fixed. But we can retread this ground because it's quite fertile ground for discussion. Yeah, we spend so much time going to American examples like Martin Luther King. Do we even talk about Stuart Hall? Like,
Yeah. I want to be. I'm going to speak in my vulnerabilities and in my transparency because I think it's important to role model that. So, like I said, I can tell you all of the Toni Morrison books that I've read, Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston. Like when it comes to Black women's writing, it's particularly Black Americans women's writing that I'm the most confident on and most thorough with. There's Black British women writers that I have read, but I have to be very transparent to say it's not on the same level of attention. I think that's the best way to describe it. My level of attentiveness is not the same. And I think it's because this is not to blame, it's not a blame game, because I want to take responsibility for myself as well. But I think it's about, in the UK, my relationship to Blackness is so different to perhaps, say, you know, the girls of Galdem generations, you know, because they've had the opportunity, literally like Galdem, to curate and produce their own visioning of Blackness using new media technologies, whether it's just creating your own magazine, whether it's a DIY YouTube series or whatever it might be. Whereas when I was of that age equivalent, like 10 years ago, or nearly 15 years ago now, actually, I'm heading to my mid-30s, there wasn't the infrastructure. These platforms, one, this literally didn't exist, firstly, and then the infrastructure around them didn't exist. So I was relying on looking at North American examples of representation of Blackness. So watching Sister Sister, watching Moesha, watching Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, watching A Different World. All of these were the representation of Blackness that I've had in the absence of the lack of British Blackness. So I think this kind of American indoctrination that has... Sorry, my cat... Hello, Snow. My cat... Like, did you hear it? Like,
yeah, we did.
He said hello back. He's a very intelligent cat. This level of indoctrination, this cultural imperialism of Americanisms, I think happened really young with the TV shows, really young with music, although I was listening to Black
Do you think
British
it's
music.
also detrimental to our ideas? And also
Totally, because it's always then in response as opposed to how are we shaping things on our same scale. Again, with the intellectual thought, I only really discovered someone like Stuart Hall when I was doing my MA, so I was about 23, 24.
I just wonder, in that whole process of me up in my first degree, why didn't they put in Stuart Hall?
So it's interesting because Stuart Hall comes in. So the Stuart Hall that gets taught at BA is always going to be around media theory. It's not going to be around his stuff on cultural identity or race or colonialism. That Stuart Hall, that radical Stuart Hall, the critical, the asking Stuart Hall gets left to the side. But the Stuart Hall that talks about encoding, decoding, and media studies and cultural studies will be taught in the curriculum. And you wouldn't necessarily know that you're reading someone Black, right? With a name like Stuart Hall, you wouldn't know that. You know Stuart Hall is Black when you're reading an essay like Old Ethnicities, New Ethnicities, or Cultural Identity and Diaspora. That's how you know you're reading a Black person.
I have to put my hand up in this case now because I've tried reading Stuart Hall and then I just feel like I do that face that I usually do when I'm just like, okay, like where are you going? Where are you going? Send me the names of the
Yeah, I mean Stuart Hall, I prefer
like not just reading around the subjects and getting around like because sometimes it's each one teach one out there.
I will definitely send you some of my favourite Stuart Hall essays. I'm a big Stuart Hall fangirl. I'm not a big fan of his media theory stuff, not because it's not good, it's just because I prefer when he's writing about colonialism or Blackness or Britishness. I'll send you an essay that you really like called Whose Heritage. That's a brilliant essay.
Okay.
I feel like when Stuart Hall is towards the later end of his life, when he perhaps had developed the Stuart Hall, the legacy of who he was, and he was very much a living legacy. I think that's when he probably felt that he had the freedom to really write and really say what he wanted to say. And I feel like if you look at the trajectory of his writing, when he starts heading into stuff around ethnicity and race, towards the end of his life, it gets much more harder, much more critical, and also of himself, which I think is really interesting. We start seeing him ask these very uncomfortable conversations about being a brown-skinned, middle-class Jamaican and the privileges that he had in the context of Jamaica, and then traveling here to the UK as a 19-year-old. He came here so young, you know. He studied like medieval literature at Oxford or Cambridge, one of the two, and dropped out. It was like, no, you know, he really came in on the colonial
That's the point
project.
of alienation for a lot of students of diverse backgrounds at university. Medieval literature. I've only grown a slight appreciation of it because I did parts of it A-level standard. But even then, I was made to feel a lot of the time when I was writing about it that I knew nothing. And I realized there's another problem because the people who teach medieval literature come at it with such a certain slant to it. And you don't realise that they're quoting Ibn Saud, or that they're quoting this person, and they're talking about Seneca, and they're talking about that person. And you just get to the point where you're like, okay, it's another Northern European tale from a very provincial background that is apparently important that I need to sink my teeth into, without them even saying, but this also applies to you, because there's no discursiveness on the value, the universal values, if I can even use that phrase, of that sort of literature.
Definitely, and it goes back to the point about the citation, that actually, even when you look at medieval literature through the Crusades, and okay, the Crusades was quite problematic in terms of how it was, you know, expanding into Moors and like going into parts of Africa and stuff, but actually it was problematic not as an act of colonization though. It was problematic in terms of just act of like the straight warfare, and that the like Europeans were encountering black and brown people's culture, but again, not as a act of colonizing. It was an act of, oh, this is very different. What can I learn? And there is citing happening there. In fact, if you look at some of the tapestries of the courts in the UK, we're seeing black and brown bodies in positions of power. And so race isn't a thing, you know, up until the departure to the Americas. That's when race as this power construct becomes a thing of around system of power and control. Before that, Europeans were encountering non-Europeans all the time and valuing their culture quite highly.
Equitable exchange.
Yes, totally.
I think where the whole cultural appropriation argument falls apart.
Yes, I agree.
It's not just that people are taking from other cultures, it's that they're not quoting other cultures.
Yes.
And I think that's the only way you can unsquare that circle. And on Twitter, it's just like, let me drag Nike for using a black baby next to a black cross. Like, does no one understand? Like, does no one put into their mind that
the Black Madonna?
You know, why don't like, we can understand the Black Madonna, but not as what in the West. It's not widely represented, and it's funny, if you look at the Eastern Church, Black Madonnas are everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is the thing, like, you know, you go to the Greek Coptic church and you'll see a Black Madonna, you know, that is just the visual symbolizing, and the Black Jesus as well. So it's interesting about cultural appropriation and how to kind of locate it historically, but also to understand the power play behind it. And I think for me, the best way to understand cultural appropriation is that it's a legacy of colonialism, and it's a legacy of, to quote someone like Bell Hooks, eating the other, which is when dominant culture consumes the culture of the marginalized to just further continue the power play at hand. So, but then there's moments in history about whether it's the histories of antiquity, so ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and their relationship to Egypt and Ethiopia, or medieval histories and the Crusades and the relationships between like the Moors. There's enough history that shows that cultural appropriation wasn't racialized and it wasn't about a power dynamic. It's a much more recent phenomenon, and history of colonialism is the
people can say things like
the foundation. Yeah,
that's why people like David Olusola can say it doesn't exist. It's almost like it's a concocted thing, but without having these discussions and without citing sources, and citing arguments, the whole appropriation debate that's usually had falls apart, because it's just, let me drag someone from the obvious ignorance.
I mean, the whole, like, I have lots of, my thoughts changes on like cancel culture and dragging someone. So sometimes, again, I try to frame it in like the fanon of like, the violence of the oppressed is not the same violence of the oppressor. And then sometimes I think about systems of the industrial complex of prisons, and how dragging someone and cancel culture is actually online public flogging, you know?
Yeah, it is.
And something that you would do in the Middle Ages, but also like public hangings of,
the memes that come with it, the memoration, the continuous, the idea that one straight moment of an archived thought is also a representation of a whole thought process.
And it also
one wrong word sometimes is enough to put what may be a well-seeming comment into the realms of into the realms of scandal. But at the same time, you have to remember that words are important. These are the same people who don't like being dragged for their words, who would not defend you for being dragged for your words. Because your words are apparently violent, because you're exposing truth, whereas they are just talking. I'm just talking.
And this is the thing. This is where, so that's where I feel like, cancel culture. So I think it really is about, I think it's who's doing the saying or who's doing the speaking, and what is being said. And I feel like dragging or cancelling someone like Lawrence Fox, to me, isn't the same as dragging someone like Kanye. So yes, they're both saying really problematic things, both quite racialized things, but then I would like to believe, to have empathy, to understand why Kanye is, and why Lawrence Fox is the reason why Lawrence Fox is. And yes, they might say similar things, but their histories to that point of that comment, or to that point of ideology, isn't the same. And it's like, how do we give space for one, for accountability, but also one for forgiveness, but also how do we have like different ideas of justice that isn't caught up in prisons or in the state functions of courts? And how do we think about justice as something that means that harm, if you call someone harm, you can never change that, you can never repair that, but we can act much more responsibly. What does that mean?
I think it's important that you bring up that point, because a lot of the time we don't rehabilitate, but it's our job to do the rehabilitation. Like it gets to a point where we have to do the counselling of these individuals, and we have to placate them. Okay, today, don't murder me as much as you did yesterday. That was just plain wrong, and I'm no longer here to hear you. But tomorrow, you can murder me a little bit more kindly. Like, where does it end?
Zora Neale Hurston, she's such an unsung hero, again, a Black American woman, FYI, from the Harlem Renaissance. She's probably an unsung hero for so many different reasons. But she has a great quote that says something like, if I don't speak out now, they'll murder me and say that I enjoyed it. And the other really famous quote that people quote of her, that don't always cite her, which is, all your skin folk is not your kinfolk.
I always said that.
Yeah, that's Zora Neale Hurston. That's a quote
that
she has cited. But my favorite quote is, if you suffer in silence, they will kill you and say that you enjoyed it. And I think there's something so key about that.
All your skin folk and not your kinfolk line. I need to start using that. I'm going to put these two lines. If you write them down and send them to me, I'm going to make
I can definitely do that. And I think what I love about that, I mean, one, it's so ludicrous, it's so funny, and she's such an amazing, witty writer who was doing something so different about race. She was trying to do a different conversation about race when she was writing in the 30s, in comparison to like the Ralph Ellisons and the Richard Wrights, who were, I would argue, low-key writing to a white audience. Zora was writing to a black Southern audience, you know. And they couldn't handle her writing because there was no trauma. She was writing about love,
some trauma.
you know, and
they wanted some trauma.
Yeah, they couldn't. They said she wasn't writing about the black experience because there was no pain in her characters.
But we talked about this also in the first show, because there was a whole segment on how black experience is always traduced through the prism of violence and pain,
of like trauma. I feel like she's a great example because there's this woman, a single woman, a fabulous woman, may I add. She was known to dress in furs and feathers, and you know, she came in, you knew she was in the room, like a larger than life character. And all of her, she hasn't got lots of books, she has 2. And my favorite one is The Eyes Were Watching God. And it's about effectively a black woman deciding she's going to be on her own, and she's going to be okay with that. And she's going to have a nice house, and she's going to fight for her right to her space. And she goes through 2 abusive, she falls in love, she has one loving relationship and one abusive relationship. And because it's not about a downtrodden black woman, it's about a black woman fighting for her rights in 20s America, Zora was often, like I said, accused of not writing about the authentic black struggle because no one goes through suffering. Her characters had too much joy, too much love. You know, how dare you express that? Maybe for some black people, their lives isn't always marked by racism in this really stark way, and that they're able to build communities in of themselves.
I think
how dare you have that imagination?
Talking about racism for one podcast, not podcast. What am I talking about? for one time, we should actually ban ourselves from talking about racism.
Yeah, I agree. I want to, you know, I don't want to be talking about racism all the time, and I want to talk about, when I'm in conversation with other black people, for us to be like, what are you watching? What are you reading? You know,
that's what I want to do. I do anyway. But I think it's important when you're talking about practice with other people, I have to talk about what's your perception of blackness. Because at the end of the day, that informs how they actually create their work.
Yes.
And if I don't do it, I'm actually not bringing out something that's not discussed by other sources. For example, it's easy for people to look at work and go, you know, this guy's obviously being a Basquiat. Okay, but where the aesthetic might be similar, but what is this person saying that's different to what Basquiat said?
And I think it's, again, using your word, it's lazy. It's like, why is it not just possible to read things on its terms without having to read it through something else? And I think what happens sometimes is that I'm probably going to say something really controversial, but you know, I said what I said. So I kind of like, and I'm speaking to black people in particular, but I kind of want us to be able to give ourselves the freedom to think beyond canons. And I mean, like, not necessarily the white canon, I mean the black canon of certain kinds of artists, of, you know, of how we produce work, and to think, is it possible for us to produce work, and that doesn't have to be artistic work, it could be written in of itself without it having to be always contextualized through the sociological? Is it possible just to have it contextualized just through as a piece of work existing in of its own right? We can, if we want to attach the sociological, of course, but how would it render it different if we just said, no, here's a piece of work, let's look at it?
Rendering that question transparent, I would flip it on its edge. What happens when you do that sort of work and it's always contextualized wrongly in the of trauma, and it is always read through the prism of being a work that is meant to or speaks to the act of disavowal of trauma? when no, you're just dancing. For example,
Yeah.
I've had a few people on here. The one that comes to mind is Charlotte
Yeah.
and her work, which is about representing and representing, as Gail reminded me, a little bit of Fanon there. If you didn't catch it, when he talks about the invention of the earth, when he talks about the creation of new culture, for you to, in order for you to fight against colonialism, you need to create your own culture, not in opposition to, but in response to your own needs. And I think we need to get to the point where we start talking about creating our culture in light of our own needs. And not allowing others to continuously be the gatekeepers of the destiny of our conversation.
Definitely. And I think that, there's a lot to say in response to that. And I had something I wanted to respond to, and I was like, it's the thought process has gone. So I'm just going to have to meander, hopefully, whilst I find my way.
Meander through it.
Through it. It kind of made me think about like certain books, certain writings where, I had to talk about Terry again, undermining my own point about North America, but I will introduce.
We still know that we're sellouts. So.
To introduce someone like Toni Morrison, who will often, even though she is, a Nobel Prize winner for literature, throughout her career was often criticized for not writing about white people, and for writing about Black people, and for writing about Black Americans in their fullness, where there was trauma, but it wasn't the overarching or the only thing that was present in her work. She gave us a full breadth of humanity and loving relationships, and that just was not good enough. Like, it wasn't an easy, if you've seen the documentary, it wasn't an easy sell for Toni Morrison to get her work out there. We see her at the, God rest her soul, at the, at the peak of her career, but it wasn't, an easy ride to get through where she is. And there's other writers, Mel Collins is a Grenadian writer who conceived the name of a book, and I can't remember what it's called. Again, another writer that makes me think about, like, what does it mean when you write about the Caribbean free from exotica? And about its complete mundane, boring, everydayness.
Exogenous. I was talking about exoticism because it also has an exogenous part where it's not of our body. And remind yourself, they're talking about you. Okay, guys, this is going to end in 2 minutes. So,
okay.
Hey, do you want to renew it, or do you want to go and do something else?
What is the time? So I don't have no time.
8.
I'm happy to do like another half an hour, then I need to go and do dishes.
Okay, we'll do that. I'll just take you off. See you in 2 minutes, guys.